If your engine sounds like a sewing machine on overdrive with a loud, clattering noise, your valves might be too loose. Conversely, if the engine is running rough and missing, the valves could be too tight, causing them to stay open slightly during combustion. We're going to fix both of those problems by performing a mechanical lifter valve lash adjustment. This process, also known as setting the tappet clearance, brings your valve timing and clearance back into perfect alignment. To do this, you need a set of flat feeler gauges, standard screwdrivers and wrenches, and a socket to turn the crankshaft. Before you touch a tool, you must check your manufacturer's service manual for the exact clearance specifications, noting specifically if the engine needs to be tested hot or cold. Safety and access come first. Disconnect the primary feed wire going to the ignition coil to disable the ignition system completely. This guarantees the engine won't accidentally start while your hands are near moving parts. Then, remove the valve cover to expose the rocker arms and lifters. Taking a few extra minutes to properly disable the ignition and gather the right specs keeps you safe and ensures you don't cause catastrophic damage to the valve train once we start making adjustments. We have to measure the valve clearance when the valve is fully closed. To do that, we need to manually rotate the engine until the piston for the cylinder we are working on reaches top dead center on its compression stroke. Put a socket and ratchet on the front crankshaft pulley bolt. Slowly turn the engine over by hand in its normal direction of rotation. Look closely at the camshaft. You want the pointed tip of the cam lobe for the specific valve you're adjusting to point completely away from the rocker arm, typically straight down. As you can see in this diagram, the bottom half of the cam is perfectly round. This is called the base circle. When the lifter rides on this base circle, the valve is completely closed and resting squarely on its seat. You can physically verify this. Grab the rocker arm and try to move it up and down. You should feel a slight wiggle. That little bit of play tells you the valve is entirely closed. If you try to measure the clearance while the lifter is touching any part of the lobe's ramp, you will get a false reading. Adjusting the valve based on that false reading will hold the valve open during combustion, burning the valve and leading to engine failure. This service manual page highlights a crucial detail. Intake and exhaust valves usually have different clearance specifications. The exhaust valve gets hotter and expands more, so it generally requires a wider gap. Select the exact flat feeler gauge that matches the specific valve you are testing. Slide that specific feeler gauge directly into the gap between the bottom of the rocker arm and the top of the valve stem. As you push and pull the gauge through the gap, pay close attention to the friction. You are looking for a slight drag. It should feel like pulling a piece of paper out from under a magazine, smooth with just a mild, even resistance. If you have to forcefully shove the gauge into place, the gap is too tight. And always double-check your manual. Swapping the exhaust spack onto an intake valve will throw off the timing and performance. If the drag isn't right, you need to adjust the clearance. Use a box end wrench to loosen the lock nut located directly under the adjuster screw on the rocker arm. With the nut loose, take your screwdriver and turn the adjusting screw. Backing it out moves the screw up, widening the gap. Turning it inward pushes it down, closing the gap. Keep your feeler gauge inserted right in that gap while you turn the screw. This allows you to feel the drag change in real time as the adjuster screw descends and lightly pinches the metal gauge. Getting this right relies entirely on two things matching up: the exact thickness of the gauge and that precise feeling of smooth drag. Hitting that target guarantees the valve will close fully and transfer heat away from the combustion chamber properly. Now that the clearance is dialed in, you have to lock it in place. Hold the screwdriver dead steady with one hand to freeze the adjuster screw exactly where it is. While keeping that screwdriver absolutely motionless, use your other hand to firmly pull the wrench and tighten down the lock nut. Do not let the screwdriver rotate even a fraction of a millimeter. This exact moment is where most first-time valve adjustments fail. It's a mechanical problem known as the lockdown shift. As you torque that nut downward, the twisting friction grabs the adjusting screw's threads and pulls the screw down with it. Even a tiny shift will clamp down on the gap, resulting in an over-tightened valve. Because of this, there is a mandatory final step. You must re-measure the gap after the lock nut is completely tight and your tools are off the rocker. Slide your feeler gauge back through the gap one last time. It needs to have that exact same slight drag it had before you locked it down. If the gauge binds up and gets stuck, or if it suddenly feels loose, you experienced a lockdown shift. Loosen the nut, reset the screw slightly, and try the lockdown process again. Once that gap is locked and verified, move to the other valve on this cylinder. After both the intake and exhaust are set, manually crank the engine to the next cylinder in the firing order and repeat the whole sequence. It takes patience, but making a habit of verifying that final gap after every single lockdown separates a reliable, professional-grade adjustment from a mistake that causes a burnt valve. With all the valves adjusted, wipe down the mating surfaces and reinstall the valve cover. Now is the ideal time to use a fresh valve cover gasket. Then, safely reconnect the feed wire to your ignition coil. Start the engine. Instead of a loud, erratic clatter, it should idle smoothly. You should only hear a normal, faint, rhythmic ticking sound coming from the mechanical lifters doing their job. Keep track of your mileage and check your service manual for the recommended intervals so you know exactly when it's time to check the clearances again. A precise valve lash adjustment restores your engine's lost power and protects the internal components from heat damage. More importantly, it gives you a direct, hands-on understanding of how the heartbeat of your engine really works.